Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Cybersecurity in Focus, the podcast brought to you by Recon Cyber. I'm your host, Katie Watson, and I can't quite believe it, but we are finally here at episode 10, the final episode of season 1. A massive thank you to all our guests who have shared such wisdom and knowledge this season, and a big thank you to you, our listeners who've tuned in. I think today's episode captures exactly why we created this series. It is an honest, experience-led conversation with someone who's been in the room and seen it all happen. Today's guest is Glenn Wilkinson. Glenn is an ethical hacker with over 15 years of experience legally breaking into organizations, from startups to the government. And when he is not hacking or speaking about it, he is helping organizations prevent ransomware through his work with innovative endpoint technologies at Agger Labs. In this episode, we get into 3 things. First, how hackers actually think. Second, what can we learn from the big breaches? And finally, what is the nation state threat and what does it actually mean for you? So without further ado, let's get into it. Hey, Glenn, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, you're very welcome, Katie. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
I'm so excited to have you here. You have a really cool background as an ethical hacker. So you really know how to get into the mind of how a hacker thinks. So I'm going to just jump straight in with the questions because I have so many for you today. And the first is just like, when you start a penetration engagement sort of test, where do you begin? Not really with a tool set, but in terms of like, how do you think about approaching it?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. I've been doing this. Got to count. Coming on 15 years as a pen tester, ethical hacker now, being paid to break into systems. And even though the tools have changed over the years, the mindset and the methodology remain consistent. And the way I explain it is often it's not so much about the tools, because there are so many tools. And often people ask me, hey, Glenn, I want to be a hacker. What tool should I use? It's kind of like asking, well, I want to be a electrician. Should I use this voltmeter or this one? So, well, there's a lot more to the trade and a lot of higher level thinking. And whilst the tools are important, the mindset is probably more useful. And I've spent many years, Black Hat, DEF CON for law enforcement, etc., giving training. And the way I approach the training is the hacker. Well, I call it the hacker life cycle. So good hackers, so maybe not good, proficient, shall we say, putting morality aside, proficient hackers, they're very methodical. So we follow almost a step-by-step process. And I liken it to learning French or the piano. You can learn hacking, and if you're quite methodical and structured in your approach, you'll have a lot more success. And it's typically approach of, do your reconnaissance about the target. What's the internet-facing infrastructure, internal infrastructure? What do you actually want to go after? It's not just so much hack the bank. It's like, well, I want to deploy ransomware or steal things or transfer money or cause disruption. And so it's the initial reconnaissance, defining your objectives, breaking in some degree of lateral movement and pivoting through the network, making sure you have persistence. So if you get detected, you don't get booted out, finding what you actually want to achieve and performing that. Might be exfiltrating data, might be destroying things, probably some degree of erasing logs and getting out or deploying the ransomware. But in general, the short answer is methodical hackers are the best hackers and having your actual objective in mind as opposed to just hack the bank.
That's really helpful, and thinking about how they take a methodological approach to it. It's also like hackers don't always work at the technology level. They also start with people. So part of that recon might be you looking at people in an industry, and we saw actually the M&S breach, for example, that was, a near perfect example of this, where, the attackers phoned the help desk of a third party impersonating an employee. There was human interaction. Why does that work, and how do we better approach it?
It's almost getting boring telling the story, because every year, this year, last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, my story is almost consistent. Most breaches start with some degree of human interaction or human error. If you go back maybe 20 or 30 years, back then when systems weren't as well regulated, defended, updated, patched, it was a little bit easier maybe to compromise the router and then the server and then the web application. We've kind of gone up the network stack. And as defenders, we're quite good these days at making sure that the technological things are in place to keep you safe, but keeping your staff safe is somewhat consistently difficult. I think we are getting better, but the reason hackers go after the humans is because there's a good degree of success in doing that. So like the M&S instance that you mentioned, hackers phoned the help desk, as a third-party help desk, offshore third-party help desk, hey, it's Bob from accounting, I can't log in, can you help? Adding some degree of urgency, I have a report due in an hour, I'm going to get fired. Can you help me? Some degree of authenticity. Yeah, it's not too hard to prove, hey, it's Bob from accounting. Here are my credentials, or here's my proof that I am who I say I am. And then either, hey, my MFA thing is broken, I really need some help. Or we have a thing called MFA fatigue, where we just spam the real user with tons of MFA prompts, and hopefully eventually they kind of click one. And it seems to consistently work. The vast majority of recent breaches are down to some kind of human component.
It's really hard because you can buy all the technology in the world, but at the end of the day, there is always going to be people. And I think reminding ourselves of that, it's not just buying more tech.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the important thing is to empower and protect people without putting the onus on them. I think I would say, as in cybersecurity industry, it's our fault that users are routinely tricked into doing things. A lot of people kind of say, stupid user, they click the link. They should know that you have to check for, it should be server.microsoft.com, not microsoft.server.com. You got to check for the S in HTTPS. Oh, that's obviously fake. Like, there's so many small details that we can trick users with. I think it's very unfair to put the security onus on them. So there's definitely work to be done. And I think it comes down to, there are clever technologies, but working with people and not putting the onus on them, and us as the industry taking a lot of responsibility for saying, Bob in accounting, he needs to look after accounting. Cybersecurity is not his job. So how can we alleviate him of having to worry about that?
Yeah, definitely. And the way you said protect, you're also, you're protecting your people as well as your business. And this isn't stuff we were, taught in school. Some of it didn't, well, most of it didn't even exist when some of us were in school. And things like, if you randomly surveyed your organization, how many of them would know what the difference between, HTTP is and HTTPS is, rather than just telling someone, like, it doesn't help the way we learn. So there's definitely a lot of stuff we can do in that space. And the intersection now where I think people every day are seeing this is because of all the recent attacks. There have been so many, and for the first time, it's really, household names, always on the news. And the JLR attack last August, it was one of the most financially damaging cyber attacks in British history. First of all, how would you go about explaining what lessons we can learn from those attacks? For example, with the JLR attack, the attacker was in the network for quite a while. How do you explain how that happens, how organizations can be wary and defend of that first?
Such a good point. On average, hackers spend 197 days on your network before you even know they're there. That stat goes up and down a day or two each year, but it's fairly consistent, say around 200 days. I am very seldom caught on an actual ethical hacking pen test engagement, and I'm quite noisy because if I get caught, well, there's no real ramification or anything. If you're a hacker, you might go to jail or you might lose your access. So we're not, as an industry, we're not that great at actually detecting that hackers are on your network. You generally find out one of three ways. Either ransomware is deployed, big red scary pop-up message, give us money, your files are gone, or a friendly hacker tells you, hey, did you know access to your systems is up for sale on the dark web? Or you read about it in front page news, some huge data breach, something in that direction. And in order to remediate that, there's a lot of things that we can do. I can tell you the only way I've ever been caught on an engagement, and the consistent solution that I see, is some degree of deception technology. What I mean by that is having technological solutions in place that hackers will trip over when they're trying to reach their objective. And there's all kinds of solutions and tech and ideas in that space. But the general idea is something in the direction of canary tokens, honeypots, that kind of thing. My favorite company to recommend is Thinks out of South Africa. They have their canary tokens, which are free, and then the canaries, which are the physical or virtual devices. And essentially, hackers can't tell the difference. So one example is you can add a canary token to a document, call it passwords, leave it sitting on the domain controller's desktop. Hacker comes along and opens that document because it looks super enticing, and the canary sings back and says, hey, someone's poking around where they shouldn't. Won't stop them, but it'll get that 200 days down to possibly minutes. Or having the actual canaries, which are basically honeypots that don't suck, make it look like a file server or whatever you want. On top of that, you have what I call basic cyber hygiene. I'm always harping on about that. There are tons of very cool AI-powered shiny things. But most breaches come down to getting your basic cyber hygiene wrong. Are your users reusing passwords? Are you leaving tokens and API keys laying around? Are you updating your systems? How are your backups? Is your network segmented? Getting those basics right, having a framework in place. If you're listening to this or watching, you don't have a framework, Cyber Essentials, it's free. Then upgrade to Cyber Essentials Plus. There may be NIST or something. But having those kind of frameworks in place tend to unlock budgets to then do maybe cooler or more interesting things. But in general, I forget what the question was, but I would say, yeah, hackers get in far in advance, and having deception tech can let you know, and having a basic cyber hygiene like network segmentation, blast radius reduction, and things like that can help mitigate the larger damage.
That's a super helpful answer, because I think going back to like, it's kind of how do these attackers get in the networks for so long? And something I wanted to touch upon there was something you said about how when you do a penetration test, you're probably more noisy than a normal hacker. But if an organization hasn't, done penetration tests, which many do because, it's a requirement for a lot of compliance structures and frameworks, then does that ever give like a false sense of security? Like, I caught that one. It's brilliant. I can get, yeah.
It absolutely does. I think it's one of the biggest problems in the industry, that false sense of security. Oh, we've done a pen test. We fixed the things they found, so now we're secure. It's almost like people drive worse when they're wearing a seatbelt, because you'll still hurt yourself a lot, even if you're wearing a seatbelt, but you have the feeling of, oh, I have this thing, now I'm invulnerable. It can often be with pen tests. Okay, we've done a pen test, so we're safe. We can be a bit more reckless, or even running antivirus. If I'm trying to trick somebody into clicking a link or doing something, some kind of human level compromise, I'm much happier when they're running antivirus, because I can bypass that antivirus, and they have a false sense, oh, I'm running antivirus, I'm safe, therefore I can click I can click this thing, it'll be fine. The AV will look after me. And I think pen tests in general have their place, but by smarter people than me, they're often referred to as fig leaf security, the notion of a little fig leaf on a statue covering the important bits. It was a talk by Haroon Mir a long time ago, and the notion that when we do a pen test, we are just replicating how other pen testers operate, as opposed to how real hackers operate. And we keep doing these pen tests and keep patting ourselves on the back when we find some obscure, weird other thing. But are those the real threats that we're facing, and are they actually making a difference? I think penetration testing is still super useful. Just don't rely on it as a be all and end all. And should you pass it, okay, tick, we're absolutely fine. And often pen tests will find one weird, obscure way in, and not look at the whole breadth of issues that you may be facing. So a good pen test firm will take a breadth first approach. Maybe pick one point to drill down to kind of highlight the big scary wow moment. I think there's a lot of other stuff that we should be doing on top of pen tests, definitely.
It's definitely not just the one thing we should be doing. And it's one of those things where I can imagine when you are one of the biggest things at the moment is getting budget for security and explaining security to a board or senior management who are not necessarily, very familiar with the terminology, and also now the nuances. And I think the reason I bring this up is because it's really like easy to have we got budget for a pen test. We did a pen test. The pen testers were good. If you didn't know security, this would sound very good and like you're doing the right things. Without making it a security conversation, it's quite difficult to then be like, well, actually, here are like 100 caveats as to why we need to do this. Are the most effective ways you've seen people engage with senior management and talking about risk without making it too security focused, but also getting, the nuances to matter in the conversation?
Yeah, I think you're spot on there, almost the non-security part. The best way I find, there's two things. So one, cybersecurity should be on the agenda of all board or high-level meetings. And secondly, sometimes reframing cybersecurity as a business continuity issue rather than an IT issue. Because when it falls under IT, it can be seen as, well, it's just that computer stuff and it's that weird guy in the basement. When it's business continuity, okay, what are the things that we're worried about that would put us out of business? It's pandemics, war, cyber breach / ransomware. And when you frame it that way, you have a different person who's responsible for it, and they see the bigger picture, and definitely have the CISO or the security guy, whoever it is, in the conversation. But from a higher the high level point of view, business continuity and risk seems to be, I think, a better way to get board buy-in, and then have the security guy, the CISO, there to kind of explain, okay, the risks, rewards, benefits. Why do we need a pen test? Why do we need all this tooling? Why do we need counter ransomware software when you promise me that Microsoft Defender or CrowdStrike will look after us, and now you're telling me actually you have to buy that amazing new Agger Labs technology. I make that. And translating that into business case requirements and stacking up the numbers. A ransomware attack costs an organization £5 million. Are we willing to accept that risk, or do we need some extra software or something else in place?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think. And I liked how you touched on like war as like a potential threat, because this is kind of what we're starting to see now. And I think maybe more those medium-sized enterprises weren't necessarily thinking about, but it was something that has been spoken about from the NCSC. Richard Horn, he's spoke about how actually a lot of things their team are dealing with, the serious incidents, are originating not maybe always directly, but sometimes indirectly from nation state attacks. And this is a real shift in the conversation where previously it was thinking, okay, you've got like some random hacker, like teenager in their basement, and now we're discussing nation state attacks. Do you agree with this framing, first of all? And what does it mean in practice for how organizations should be thinking about threat modeling?
Yeah, it's an interesting one to unpack, the whole nation state threat. And I think to frame it, if we go back and think about how we got here, because we've always had hackers. I mean, as long as you've had computers, so say since the 60s, you've always had hackers, and their objectives have maybe changed over time. Who's behind the attacks and what are their objectives? So we go back, way back in the day, it was more about curiosity and tinkering, maybe defacing websites in the 90s, maybe a tiny bit of hacktivism during that time. If you don't agree with a news website, you break in, you deface the website, but nothing to critically damage an organization, never mind an entire nation state. We probably get to early 2000s, late 2000s, we start seeing the real threat of nation state hacking. Probably Stuxnet was the first good example of that, somewhat timely perhaps. US-Israeli joint operation to infect and damage Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities, spin up centrifuges too fast, do physical damage. We start seeing around that time, as a nation state, we have a lot of stuff online we want to protect, and our adversaries have stuff online that we want to attack and disrupt. And that increase in attack surface area and reliance on technology is, that's how we got to where we are today. And we're definitely seeing a lot of that. So Stuxnet's a prime example, but even in recent incidents. So when the US had their operation in Venezuela, operation was an absolute resolve. There was a degree of cyber command going in first. We think from reports it looks like they turned the lights off to make it easier for their choppers to get in and do the kinetic damage. Is in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, there's consistent cyber elements from day zero. It was back in 2022 when Russia first invaded. The first strike was disabling communications. Luckily, Ukraine had backup systems and old school systems, and old school and new school. They relied on WhatsApp and Signal and things when satellites and military command got taken down. And up to the recent Iran-Israel-US conflict, we see a big degree of cyber coming into that. And it goes both ways. So the big superpower coming in, they disrupt maybe air defense systems, they hack cameras, IP cameras to figure out where leaders are and things like that. And then you see Iran coming back with their own capabilities, but not always nation state, nation affiliated. So we saw a lot of private companies getting hacked by maybe they're Iranian hacktivists, maybe they're loosely affiliated, maybe they're even Western nations who don't agree with what they're doing. There's almost guerrilla style warfare there, because you can do a lot of damage as just the average hacker disrupting or deploying ransomware or hacking into Western companies just to do some degree of damage. And in terms of what Richard Horn there said, it's definitely something to worry about. It's hard to understand the exact risks and implications. And is it nation state attacks or nation state loosely affiliated attacks? And just because an attack comes from a Chinese IP address, does that mean that it's a nation state? Even if it's from a supposed government IP address, attribution can be super difficult. But there's definitely an uptick of capabilities and desire. And the recent conflicts are just kind of highlighting, okay, any future conflicts, we need to be ready both as attackers and defenders. I think often we talk about, China, they're going to hack us, Russia's going to hack. Well, we have our, in the West, in the UK, we have our own capabilities and we're doing the same things. It's definitely, just the the nature of modern conflict. That NCSC report, I think, that they highlighted there were 419 cyber incidents in the last year, of which 208 were critically significant and 18 were highly significant, indicating that they could do serious harm to the UK's way of life. And that's pre-conflict. If we get drawn into some large conflict and cyber attacks start coming, I think there's potential to be in quite a pickle if we're not ready.
It's definitely something worth thinking about now and coming to our attention. It's a way of thinking about maybe risks that we haven't necessarily had to touch on before, but ignoring it is also not going to do any help. And I think the idea of it being maybe nation state affiliated is also a way for smaller businesses and smaller organizations who maybe actually are just in maybe they're a third party in a supply chain. Maybe they're not the main, target, but they're in it. That is maybe now a sign that they actually should be thinking about, the likes of, like you said, Cyber Essentials, maybe, Cyber Essentials Plus. It's something that we all need to start thinking about. Has there been a, attack that stood out to you in your entire career that's been like a really big pivotal change in the industry?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so an attack that has stood out. I mean, an interesting one. So definitely the JLR attack last year, just because of the degree of damage it did to everyone. So definitely in the UK and probably globally too. What's the figure? Is it 2 billion, 3 billion, 4 billion? It knocked off 0.5% of our GDP. There's a slight slump and a mini recession because a bunch of hackers decided to break into an organization via some third-party way in. And I think it illustrated a few things. It illustrated the fragility of the systems in two ways. So one, there's almost a technological fragility. And when you have systems that, it's almost going to systems thinking, but when you have systems that are this complex and not resilient, the impact from a breach over here and the way it can manifest and spread can damage the entire system. So we don't have a lot of resilience. And then the second point of resilience is around supply chain and supply chain risk. And we have the way we exist these days is what we refer to just in time. So we don't have stockpiles, we don't have reserves, we don't have resilience. It's kind of expected that things should operate and things get passed along just in time. And Jaguar Land Rover will survive to some degree, government initiatives and funding, and I don't know if you want to call it a bailout or something in that direction. But who got hurt the most was probably the workers who may be laid off and all the other entities in the supply chain, because there are so many in and out, and they are the ones that are going to go under because they face a month of downtime. They can't pay salaries, they can't pay rent to keep the office going, and they are the ones who get hurt the most. So it's probably the most significant in recent times. The other one that almost set the scene in that direction was probably the NotPetya attack. That was back in 2016-ish, 2016, 17. That was what looked like a ransomware attack. So in Ukraine, there's a company called Medoc. They're an accounting company, and they got hacked. And the nice, lovely update software got replaced with some very horrible, what looked like ransomware called NotPetya. Almost every business in Ukraine uses that. Monday morning, they came to work. New software gets installed for accounting software, and boom, big red message. This is ransomware. Your files are gone. Pay us to get your files back. It turns out it wasn't ransomware. It was wipeaware. It looked like ransomware. If you paid up, your files got wiped anyway. That was interesting for two reasons. One, that was a major supply chain attack, again, illustrating the fragility of the supply chain. And two, it was attributed to Russia, FSB. So a very significant nation state attack. Russia was meddling with Crimea at that point in time. The nation state sponsored attack against the supply chain and having a massive, massive impact across an entire nation. So possibly those are the two big hacks in recent times that tie in the common thread together there, I think.
And so if you're like a CISO, head of IT, what can you learn from these attacks?
Yeah, there's always lessons in the post-mortem, isn't there? I think the lessons are always a few. The main point I'll always harp on about is get the basics right. It's always go back to the basic cyber hygiene. Definitely have the fancy new cool tech that you spend a ton of money on, but it's the do you have backups? Have you tested them? Do they work? Are they on-site, off-site, in the cloud? You had multiple backups. Are you enforcing MFA? Are you enforcing appropriate password controls? So that's password managers and MFA and things, or even better, pass keys. Let's retire passwords and use pass keys. And then your environment. Do you have things like conceptually zero trust, but is there appropriate network segmentation to limit what we call blast radius? A hacker breaks in here, let's make it difficult for that damage to propagate. Do we have ways and means to detect if we have been breached? So things like deception technology. Do we have appropriate playbooks? So if we have been breached or think we've been breached, do we have steps to follow? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and are those steps printed out in a physical filing cabinet? Because it's no good if they're on a file server and they've all been hit by ransomware and they're encrypted. And then I think quite importantly, do we rehearse those in a realistic way that's not just for show? So I think those types of things, getting the basics right, are the most useful things you can do, and then ensuring those are wrapped up in some kind of framework, Cyber Essentials or NIST, whatever it is, and that you have representation at the board, and the board understands the risks and understands why you need to have those things in place.
It's a really sort of clear action for people to take away from this podcast episode, which is why I really like it. The fact that people can just think about their organization, think about what they're doing, and are you doing that? If you're not, how can you start? Where can you get there? And I think everything is changing so rapidly, but having those basics is crucial. And I like that you touched on ransomware, and ransomware maybe not appearing to be like ransomware and how we're seeing it. There is a lot of conversation around ransomware as more and more organizations are starting to experience it. What are your thoughts and advice on ideas about what people should do if they face ransomware? Understanding what does it mean to pay a ransom, because it doesn't necessarily mean, like you said, doesn't always mean that it's going to come back, the data. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, in some ways, I think a whole episode to unpack by itself. Make sure we're all on the same page. For those watching, listening, ransomware, essentially, nothing special, just software that somehow hackers deploy in your systems, and it scrambles all your files' content, and then a message pops up saying, click here to chat with the hackers, and we'll negotiate a fee. You pay up a fee, usually in cryptocurrency, and they'll give you a utility to unscramble your files and get them back. Going back to the NCSC and their annual report last year, they highlighted ransomware as the biggest cyber threat facing the UK at the moment. Globally, damages are expected to hit, I think, 231 billion by the year 2031. So I would say ransomware is the biggest risk facing any organization today as an existential risk. So like earlier we spoke about, war, famine, those kinds of pandemics and things, and ransomware is definitely something that could end your organization. In terms of how you think about it and how you deal with it. So one is definitely have, we spoke about earlier, the basic cyber hygiene, have all the things in place to try and mitigate the hackers getting to that point when they deploy ransomware. So all the security measures, be it network segmentation and MFA and staff training and supply chain management, deception technology, have those things in place to try and make it as hard as possible for hackers to get to the point where they're going to deploy the ransomware or get an early alert before they deploy it. In terms of mitigating the specific risk itself, so when the word we use is detonation. When ransomware runs, we call it detonation. So to deal with ransomware detonation, you want to have something on your endpoints, so your servers, your workstations, to mitigate that threat. Should it get to that point, what is your last line of defense? And we generally refer to that as endpoint, EDR, or some kind of endpoint type solution. I genuinely think at Agger Labs, we've built something quite clever and quite special to mitigate that exact scenario. So our software runs on your endpoint, detects and kills ransomware. We don't require any updates or signatures or anything like that. So I think our solution's amazing. Check us out, but also just have something in place that can mitigate that, maybe compare us to other products. But you want some last line of defense. And then you also want to have some kind of cleanup. So do you have incident response in place? Do you have cyber insurance? Cyber insurance is an interesting one. You have to be a bit careful. Sometimes hackers will break in. They'll go through your inbox. Oh, you have $5 million of cyber insurance. Okay, we'll ransom you for $4 million. You keep $1 million for yourself for cleanup. So that's a bit of a weird caveat there. In terms of paying, that's a whole other kettle of fish to unpick. So worst case, all those protections and caveats, and you're not running Agger and everything, and the ransomware gets deployed, and then you got to choose, do you pay up or not? And at least in the UK, it's not illegal, at least at the moment. We're heading towards a world where probably if you're CNI, critical network infrastructure, it looks like it might be illegal, or at least you'll have to go through some hoops to get there. So it's more of a moral decision. I think as an organization, you need to decide in advance, what are we going to do if we get hit? Are we going to pay up or not? If we pay up while we're funding organized crime, are we morally okay with that? 2, do we have the money, and where we do pay it from? 3, although it's not illegal, there are caveats. So if the ransomware gang is based in a sanctioned state, for example, Russia, most ransomware gangs are based there, and you pay their ransom, then you're giving money to a sanctioned state, and that is a very serious crime. On top of that, if the ransomware gang has some even loose affiliation to a terrorist group and you pay up, then you're funding terrorism. Then you're going to get in a lot of trouble. So deciding if you pay and if you don't pay, have the cyber assurance in place, and have things like, do you have a negotiation team in place, either on-site or off-site? Because the first point in a ransomware attack is you click the link and you start chatting to the hackers, and they will say, hey, we want 5 million. Okay, can you do 2 million or something else? Or you don't care. Fine, you've got our data, we've got backups, we'll roll them from backup. Are you okay with your data ending up on what we call dark leak sites? If you don't pay up, then your data gets leaked on the dark web leak sites. So I think the summary there is ransomware, very serious risk, but a bigger cyber risk facing any modern organization. In terms of thinking about and handling it, make sure you have technological things in place to mitigate how hackers can get to your core important infrastructure, have something on the endpoint to detect and kill ransomware, and then have almost the soft, squishy stuff, the playbooks and the instant response and the decisions, do we pay, don't we pay, prepared in advance. And even with all of that, it's still, I've been involved in incident response cleanups, it's absolutely miserable. And yes, it's not a nice thing to have to go through.
Yeah, it's an absolutely horrible thing. And I think it's so important to talk about, though, because like you said, it's such a big threat. And those things, your understanding of how you stand morally as an organization, thinking about those things, while they're not fun to think about, it's not a nice conversation to, sit down with your CEO and explain, okay, if this ever happens, because I can imagine even as a CEO, you own a company, it goes offline. The first thing you want to do is get back online. You're like, I just want to get back online.
Fix it.
Exactly. And having those conversations in advance, whilst they're not nice conversations, are so important because that is giving you time to sit down and explain, like you have, okay, well, if we did ever pay this ransom, it's likely we'll be funding this group, which does these activities, etc., and allows for the understanding of the situation, understanding of what this threat actually is, to really be understood at a board level and for senior management to understand it, because it's more something that people see on TV and they think, oh, this is what it is. But it, like you said, is a very complex topic. And so to end this episode, it's been a very good episode in terms of how real it is about the threats, which are very, very real. But I'd like to end it on a bit more of a positive note, which is why I want to ask you the final question is there anything at the moment in this industry that gives you hope for the future?
Absolutely. Good question. I think, and you're spot on. I think when we start having these conversations, it's easy to go down the rabbit hole of, oh, it's all doom and gloom and nation state hacking and ransom and all of this. But in general, I think hackers are amazing. We need more hackers in the world. And I'm trying to change the meaning of the word for hacker to be someone who's a curious tinkerer and likes defending systems, and the opposite being a criminal hacker. These days I have to say I'm an ethical hacker. I think the default of hacker should be the good guy almost. And the reason that we have things like end-to-end encryption and secure software and all these things is because hackers get a hold of them and we tinker and we break from a place of pure curiosity to some degree to make things better, but because we just love tearing things apart. And as a bonus, we get to make the world a safer place. And most of the proficient hackers I know, we just love tinkering and tearing things apart. And I think as the world goes, it becomes more and more reliant on technology and we're online more and more, there's so much opportunity for that hacker mindset to grow and spread. And you see initiatives, I'm an ambassador at the Hacking Games, where we're on a mission to steer the youth of today away from a path of cybercriminality and towards the hacker light. You can get paid to hack into a bank, to secure systems, to help keep people safe. And I think that's such an important and needed thing, and a genuinely fun and exciting job to have to make the world a safer place.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Glenn. This has been a fantastic episode. So thanks for your time.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
That is a wrap. A massive thank you to Glenn for his time. There is a lot to take away from that conversation. First, the 197 days an attacker sits inside your network before you even know that they are there. The reminder that your board will engage with cyber when it's framed as a risk and business continuity, not just when it lands as an IT update. And finally, the nation state threat. Cyber is no longer parallel to conflict. It is conflict. So on that note, season 1 of Cybersecurity in Focus is complete. Thank you so much to every guest who gave their time and their honesty to this series. And thank you to you for listening. If you found this podcast useful, please subscribe, leave a review, or share it with someone who needs to hear these conversations. We will be back for season 2. Until then, stay secure.